Lions Rock Productions.
What has happened yeah, actually, I want to ask you a question about race because it's
Right?
such a confounding thing. One of the questions I love to ask black guests, I don't always ask it because it's a hard question, is what does the black community owe itself? And they struggle either one to have a good answer for this because it is a very hard question, but it's a fair question. And then or they say, "Ugh, I ain't answering that here." Like that will cause me a lot of problems. If we really care about race, if we really try to want to improve the condition of black folks in the United States, I mean, they're the most likely to be murdered by people who look like them. And I'm not trying to be racist. I'm just, referencing the numbers here. You look at how many black men are murdered in this nation. It's greater than the number of veterans that kill themselves, and we're desperate to solve that problem. Why aren't we desperate to solve these problems? Why does the black community struggle to reckon with what it owes itself as a community? Why is that such a hard thing to bring up? Because I mean, I believe in our ability to solve our problems, but if we're afraid to even discuss it, if we're afraid to even hold ourselves accountable, um, how in the world are we going to solve these things?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, so what does the black community owe itself? I mean, I think the same kind of normal, life affirming behavior that members of every community owe to one another. First of all, I'm libertarian enough to think that you don't owe anyone else anything but non-aggression. I mean, when people who appear to personally and politically dislike me say things like, "You should give me half your money because it's moral," I mean, my default response is kind of laughter. Like, I don't really identify with that at all.
Right.
So what do I owe everyone in the country who happens to be black? I mean, that comes down to the same sort of thing of non-aggression, friendship, if we like one another. But in terms of what actually, in terms of the sense in which you meant that, what ideas or policies would help the black community move forward? I think that to a certain extent, there are these same common sense ideas and policies that would help the poor white community or recent immigrants or whatever move forward. I think that in general, the lower the crime is in an area, the easier it is for people to live there. And I mean, there are obvious things like a more diverse police officers, i.e., like more officers, but a diverse range of them in black areas that reduce crime. I think that the better you perform in educational environments, the more likely you are to be successful as a group. And again, there are things there like the development of study culture, which has been a problem for black people and for Southern whites, by the way, through the charter schools that have been really, really successful at fixing that problem in black communities. So I don't think there's anything that's unique to black people who are now average black household, which is generally one person and maybe a kid, income over 45,000 per year. I mean, I don't think that most black people are desperately struggling, but looking at the issues that exist like crime, fatherlessness, and academic struggles and taking real steps to fix those is what the black community owes itself. I think right now the racism conversation is almost a distraction. So there are two different things going on at once. One, racism exists, but two, it doesn't have much to do with most modern problems. So if you talk to an intelligent sociologist like my guy Rod Graham online or any of the people he goes back and forth with on Twitter and other social media, and even some of my buddies, Angel Eduardo, Javier Bonilla, I mean, one thing that you'll normally hear is, well, look, we still do the audit studies and we find that 8% of people or whatever it is express racist attitudes. So, for example, you are slightly but definitely less likely to get a call back if you have a black name on your resume than if you have a white name. The study I usually cite as a political scientist is that they did a really good version of the work for, vote for question over at, I think, Pew Research recently. And they found that 8% of people, fully 8%, wouldn't vote for a black person for president with all these caveats, like they're wildly qualified, they're a member of your political party, like just a measure of pure racism. And it's an easy step from taking that to, as Ibrim Kendi does, saying, well, that obviously explains all the gaps we're seeing. Let's work on fixing racism, and then we'll talk to you about everything else. But everything else won't exist because racism will be fixed. The problem with this, though, is that if you look deeper, it doesn't make a ton of sense. At least in the modern era and for the past 40 years, the same level of racism has existed against a bunch of other groups. So in that same sort of vote for question study, widely known major poll, we found that 9% of people wouldn't vote for a Jew or a Hispanic. I believe it was 7% for a woman. And then you got into real prejudice that still exists. It was, I think, 19% for a Mormon, 21% for a gay guy, 40% for a Muslim. And the problem with this is that many of these groups, like Jews and Muslims, are the richest in the country. Hispanics face the same amount of money, bigotry as blacks, but actually earn pretty dramatically less money, at least at the individual level. And there's obviously a variable that comes into that, language fluency. So just looking at racism and saying this explains everything is really pretty non-productive. When you look at those major black problems I cited, like fatherlessness, crime, and academic struggles, it's really notable that most of those are pretty recent. So it certainly, once you adjust for class, certainly in the 1950s, I don't think you would have seen a dramatic difference between working class whites and blacks, whites and say Appalachia and blacks on some of those metrics. But I mean, and Walter Williams has pointed out, around the time of World War II, the black fatherlessness rate was about 10%. Whites were doing even better. That was like 4%, but that's not really the point. Today, the rate is, if I have this correct, 72% for African Americans, almost 40% for whites. So saying that ethnic conflict, which is dramatically decreased for whites and blacks, or racism, which has decreased about 90% for black people, is responsible for this is pretty silly. I, in general, advise just identifying the problem itself, as we would in business or the military, and solving the problem. Okay, there aren't a lot of fathers around. Can we actually start enforcing the child support laws, which we know will bring fathers back into the picture? What can we do to cut back welfare? The question of why there aren't fathers around and to what extent white and black people fighting 100 years ago had to do with that. So I don't really, and this could be a personality flaw, see that as important at all.
When we look at these problems, veteran suicide is always a good example. One is too many, and that gets into the territory of the war on suicide. And we never know what the final point is how much racism can you actually boil out before you get to an impossible, chaos focused number. I mean, you look at how many police patrols there are in the nation and how many deaths and the number of deaths. Look, they're all tragedies, but I would bet that, I don't know the numbers on this, the number of people significantly injured or killed by a falling tree or a tree limb is comparable to the number of people that are shot and killed by the police. And of those people that are shot and killed by the police, we know this, that some of these people are suicide by cop, they're deeply mentally impaired, or they're just, in a position where everybody can go, yeah, that guy needed to die. There are times when that happens. So we have this desire to have these perfect outcomes, but that's just not reality. I mean, the craziest things happen. That's why there's that chaos level. So is there a rule of thumb for things like this where police violence or anything, where racism can, like you can say, like we know when unemployment, like anything below this level, and we're kind of not worried about unemployment anymore because folks are working. What's that? Give us a sense for that, Will, if you can.
I mean, I think we're pretty close to the default level of let's move on to the next when it comes to a lot of these issues. Like, I don't know about racism. We'll talk about that in a second. By the way, a shout to Brad Hutchings in the comments who said something like, stop making excuses. Let's develop robot fathers. That's pretty funny. The interesting thing is we don't yet know how some of these things will work in 100 years. I mean, I don't see any reason that gene splicing technology couldn't make humans more or less aggressive, or make young mothers more or less likely to take care of their kids, for example. I mean, I would have no problem using those technologies to promote the traditional human virtues, for example. Robots are a bit iffier, but I mean, couldn't you have something called like the CradleBot 1206 that would monitor, I mean, but nothing crazy, but they would monitor like the glucose levels in a baby's bloodstream, so when the kid is sick, so when the kid is eating a poor enough diet that'll affect IQ. I don't really see any reason we couldn't do those things. We might find in the end that there are some tiny residual class and race and regional differences when it comes to things like, tested math intelligence. I personally don't think we will to any real extent when it comes to race. But even if we do, I mean, I certainly think that the things we can do to equalize diet and so on in the next 100 years will make a lot of this seem just primitive to us today. Like, you mean they used to feed their kids sugar water and leave them alone in front of radioactive boxes? It's like the old Irish midwives that would dip a piece of cloth in bourbon and just stick it in the kid's mouth. And now we're just sort of like, that's why they made all those drunks, huh? It's horrible. I think we'll be seen in very much the same way with our 70% father absent rate and our, kids raised by Nickelodeon and so on. And this is across all groups. But I mean, anyway, I think when we talk about a lot of these issues like cop shooting, we're pretty close to the default position of good performance right now. I mean, there are at minimum 35 million police patrols that involve a stop in a typical year in the USA. That's probably closer to 60 million stops, by the way. I see that the figure I often use was identified by someone in law enforcement patrols with a stop, so you can have 2 stops. But I mean, out of that number, minimum 40 million stops, there were a total of 18 unarmed black people killed by police last year. And I don't see why we need to racialize this. There was a total of a bit under 100 people, huge white and Hispanic majority. Poor whites, actually, maybe the people most likely to get shot, as Friars pointed out. But I mean, a total of about 100 men shot by police, unarmed, probably genuinely troubling cases. Now, I personally think all 50 or whatever cops involved in that should at least face a trial, should at least be, in most cases, probably fired as officers. No reason if you can fight well enough, there's no reason to shoot an unarmed man 18 times, in my opinion. You might disagree coming from combat situations. But I mean, that's not a massive issue. We need to be able to say that in a country of 350 million people. I mean, you're talking about, if you take the full 100 figure and you view them all as unjustified, which probably isn't the case. I mean, you're talking about a 1 in 350,000 per patrol, per cycle for the officers, chance of being killed if you're just a guy minding your own business. That's a tiny, tiny, infinitesimal chance. That's on par with being struck by lightning. So when people say we need to rip the system down, we need to institutionally dismantle policing. We saw Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib say some things like this. The closing line of her tweet was, "It's just not fixable." I mean, it's not even broken. I think that there's not a massive issue there. One of the things that I will say, having grown up in the hood, spent a lot of time, decent amount of time traveling, a lot of time in competitive business. I mean, you obviously were a military man. There's a tendency among people that haven't competed to assume that the default for things is utopia. This is that golden age bullshit. Like, this is that Rousseau idea that, like, before we set up governments and militaries, people were these quote unquote noble savages living under trees, drinking ice cold water, eating acorn bread. And the reality is that we were naked savages hunting wild pigs with sharp sticks. I mean, it was like the camping trip from hell. You could never settle down. Warriors from the other tribe could jump out of the bush at any time, take all the women in your band. I mean, so this has never, ever been true, but it's still to this day, this golden age fantasy of before we developed, capitalism, whiteness, a sense of unified blackness, countries, flags, whatever BS things were perfect. No, they weren't. They were worse. They were a lot worse. But it's that idea that when we look at something like an 8% rate of racism at the level of the work for, vote for question, like at the level of these classic measurements of bigotry, that means we've almost got the problem licked. It doesn't mean that we are too far away from the normal level of 0. Right. The normal level of racism for humans is probably 100%. Like, everyone would be skeptical of the tribe over the hill that wears the color red instead of green if it weren't for our social conditioning and interracial dating and so on. So what's a figure for measured racism where we can relax maybe 5%? But to some extent, we're just making it up. Like, 8% is not all that bad.
Much hold for age. I mean, I would imagine as you get older, you become more tolerant and less worried about that kind of thing. I mean, maybe.
Well, actually, I think you become more racist as you get older. Like, I think my understanding is you're more comfortable with the races you grew up with, which would be like whites and blacks. But if you look at maybe natives out west, but if you look at like the reaction of people toward mass immigration from other nuclear powers like India, I guarantee you, like, old white or black men are not more tolerant, like are not less likely to, do a voice and make fun of the new immigrants or something. And for me, all this is like, there's so much in this debate that's never discussed. Like, a big problem for both the woke and the alt-right perspectives on a lot of this, for example, is that almost all Hispanic or South Asian immigrants are Caucasian. I mean, genetically, you're talking about like a 90% similarity to Central, if not Western Europeans. So when you say something like, look at these Hispanics struggling while we whites succeed, it's like, that's not a valid comment. You can't say something like whites do well, but Afghans don't. None of this is racial. None of this is genetic. The vast majority of this stuff, let's say, ties into questions of culture, background, tribe, so on. But I think when it comes to, just like one point, when it comes to moderating the effect of tribalism so that our cops no longer shoot every Irishman they see, or most people are willing to date interracially, I think we're doing pretty well.